Hi there, it's Matt here, and welcome back to another AMA episode, another Ask Me Anything episode. And the brilliant, the dazzling, the lively, the sparkling, the glimmering, glittering, shining, smart, twinkling individual who is asking me the anything part of that is, of course, the wonderful Dr. Eti Ben Simon. Eti, welcome back.
Hi, everyone. Great to be back.
So let's just dive straight in. As the kids say, hit me up with the first question.
I'll hit you up. The first question is about cannabis. What is the intersection between
Oh
cannabis and
no.
sleep health? That's right. You wanted to dive in. We're diving in.
Okay. Talk about a third rail lightning rod topic. You know what? It's a timely question. I get asked this question a huge amount. So let me give you the high level contours and sort of key messages here. Really, this is me going to focus on THC, which is the principal psychoactive component of cannabis. It's the thing that gets you high. And it's the thing that most people will target and use and historically have used when it comes to sleep. So really this is, yes, cannabis, but it's probably more THC info specific. And I will speak about CBD at a later point. For THC, the reason that most people begin using it is because THC, if you look at the data acutely, meaning that when you start using it in the first or second or third or even first couple of weeks, it does seem to have a sleep effect that for those people is desirable. And I'm choosing my words very carefully. What I mean by that is it can help you fall asleep. And when we bring people who are cannabis naive into the laboratory and we give them THC, and usually a standard dose, it's a controlled dose, it does make them fall asleep more quickly. The problem, however, is that, well, there's multiple problems there. It does do other things to their sleep that are not desirable. The first thing is that once you start using it frequently, once you transition from acute use, short term, to chronic use, long term, you suffer disrupted sleep patterns. You can have challenges with your circadian system. In fact, there's some literature that says that it can alter your circadian system almost as though you start to shift to become more sleep desiring of the waking daylight hours and less sleep desiring of the nighttime hours. Another component is that it can increase central brain temperature if you look at some of the animal studies. And that's the opposite of usually what we want for good continuity and quality of sleep once you fall asleep. Because as people have heard on this show many times before, you need to drop your brain and body temperature to stay asleep and get into that deep sleep. Those are some of the initial things that will happen with chronic use. And then with continued chronic use, here starts the bigger problems. You begin to develop a tolerance, and therefore the amount that you took before to get these quote unquote falling asleep benefits no longer produce the same benefits. So you have to start using either more frequently to get that sleep that you have now become dependent on cannabis for, or you need to start taking a higher dose. And that is a demonstration of dependence, and it's a demonstration of tolerance, that your system starts to build up a tolerance, and therefore you either need to use more frequently or a higher dose. The next thing, and I've certainly spoken about this, I think, in public, THC is pretty good at disrupting both the quantity and the quality of your REM sleep, of your dream sleep. And as we've spoken about on this podcast, dream sleep is critical for things like learning and memory processing, particularly associating new information together, creativity and insight, memory insight, problem solving. There are also functions of REM sleep that are linked to your emotional and mental wellness. And with disruptions in REM sleep, we see disruptions in your emotional regulation. You become more emotionally short fused. You can slip down towards the negative end of the emotion spectrum. So, if some of those things feel familiar and you're using THC for your sleep, it could in part be because of the blockade of REM sleep. One of the best demonstrations that cannabis is blocking your REM sleep is that people will firstly say, you know what, I don't remember many of my dreams once or since I've started smoking weed to try to fall asleep. And that's in part because you're reducing the amount of REM, so you're dreaming less. And then if people stop using, they have these really intense, really crazy dreams. And we describe that in sleep research as the sleep rebound model. And it's often used as a measure of a demonstration that you need a certain stage of sleep, that if you deprive an organism of that stage of sleep, yes, some things get bad. But also, if it's that necessary, then when you stop blocking it, not only does it return, but it returns in even greater volumes, demonstrating that there had been a developed hunger and need and necessity for that sleep. So you were in a debt, and the brain tries to get back some of that debt. The problem is that you never get back all that you lost. But that's another demonstration. People will say, gosh, I was just having these crazy dreams once I stopped smoking weed. I should also note REM sleep is not just there for memory, emotion, it's there for the body. There was a great study from Harvard, and they looked at sleep duration, and sure enough, using that 7 to 9 hours as a sweet spot, nothing more, but 7 to 9 hours, what they found was that the shorter your sleep, in general, the shorter your life. But when they looked at the different stages of sleep, there seemed to be one stage of sleep that predicted all-cause mortality most potently, and it was REM sleep, and it was a linear relationship. The less and less you got, the higher and higher your death risk. The more and more you got, the better your mortality prediction. And there wasn't this U-shaped function that we see with total sleep, where once you get past that 9 hours, things can start to hook back up in terms of mortality risk. And what they demonstrated, just for people to keep this in mind when they're maybe smoking weed, taking cannabis or gummies, THC, and they're blocking their REM sleep, what that study found, and it wasn't looking at THC use, it was just looking at REM sleep in general. And what they found was that for every 5% reduction in REM sleep, there was an associated 13% increase in mortality death risk rate. And that suggests a critical importance of REM sleep for overall health and longevity. Some of the other things that start to happen when you're using THC, you can start to suffer from memory impairment. Some of that will be related to sleep. Some of it is just the effects of THC and cannabis on the memory systems, because your textbook-like memory structure in the brain, something called the hippocampus, has these cannabinoid, these natural cannabinoid receptors, and you can impact it in that way. I would say that other than the REM sleep blockade, the principal reason that sleep science does not currently advocate for the use of cannabis or THC is because of what happens when you stop. You will suffer a really vicious insomnia. And in fact, if you look at something called the DSM-5, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for Mental Health, it's basically the psychiatrist's handbook for diagnoses. If you look at cannabis use disorder, the definition of cannabis withdrawal syndrome, and there is such a thing, has top and center sleep disruption. And you get a really quite vicious insomnia rebound. And indeed, if you look at the data on why people relapse from their attempt for abstinence from cannabis, the main reason is that they say, my sleep just got so bad, I couldn't take it anymore, and I just had to start using again. So those are some of the downsides that I feel responsible to tell you about. I also feel responsible to tell you about any emerging data that would say, is there anything good about cannabis? And there may be very tentative, nowhere near clear enough for any recommendation whatsoever. So you can see how much of a disclaimer I'm putting in there. Therapeutic potential in a very specific population. And that population is a population of a set of patients with a sleep disorder that we've spoken about also here, which is called sleep apnea or heavy snoring. And there was an early set of studies that hinted at when people were saying that they were using THC or being administered THC, there seemed to be a slight reduction in the severity of the sleep apnea, of the snoring and the different snoring metrics that we use. And then there was a study that followed up, and it used a much more stringent experimental design. And they used a medically controlled synthetic cannabidiol, and it's called dronabinol. What they found was that dronabinol significantly reduced the number of apnea events, which is where you stop breathing, with a modest but significant 32% reduction in apnea severity over several weeks of drug administration compared to placebo. So I would say that that's interesting data. I don't think it's anywhere near, these are not randomized clinical controlled trials. We have no idea. But I also feel it's responsible to give a representative view of the data. The other maybe caveat you could say of a potential upside is that a collection of patients will report decreasing their use of the older prescription sleeping pills that right now modern day medicine doesn't necessarily advocate for. And so perhaps there could be some combination of medical grade cannabis and the different analogs of that that are useful, that don't get you high, maybe don't have as many side effects, but have the benefit of allowing people to maybe transition to some of the newer sleep medications or transition to cognitive behavioral therapy. So it could be a bootstrapping bridge to better sleep salvation, because getting off those classic sleeping pills is really difficult too. I think it's probably closer to what, like 11 or 12 points rather than 9 or 10. But I don't know if that was helpful, Eti. And do you have any thoughts or additions there, such as your wisdom?
That was fascinating. I didn't know about the apneas. I wonder if it means that their sleep is actually becoming more shallow.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the mechanism right now, and I'm really trying to remember this paragraph in the paper, as I said, I have this strange sort of visual memory. I believe they were suggesting that it may not necessarily be an effect on deeper slow wave sleep, which you're right, it could be, because that's where often things can get even more severe with sleep apnea, but also in REM sleep too. They were suggesting that it could be due, I believe, to changes in histamine regulation in the body and the respiratory function of serotonin or 5-HT. So I think the mechanism is very unclear. And I think that that was that lovely paragraph that you wait for in these types of papers where the science is great. They've done all the experiments. The stats are great. And, I think a discussion, which is the final part of a scientific paper, you have an introduction, you have a methods, a results section, and then a discussion. Once you've done it all well, you kind of have a little section where, okay, get a bit more loosey goosey, say it's interesting to hypothesize or it's intriguing to suggest. And it's just that. And that's fine. That's great. And that was the sort of moment of hand waving as to
Hmm.
what it could be. So it just your question triggered my mind there. So thank you for that.
Yeah, the discussion is where you can dream.
Exactly. Yeah. And this is where so much of our fun stuff happens at the Sleep Center, where we're discussing a new finding. And we usually try to, we're probably pretty vicious for a new finding. We try to rip it apart internally before we even think about writing a paper, because we want to make sure that we do the best job possible to make it as watertight as possible so that reviewers have the easiest time with it. But then another part of that discussion is, once the boxing gloves have been put back on after they've been taken off to pulverize the data, we have a great fun time talking about mechanism and pontificating. It's this kind of like scratchy beard moment for some of us. And you're like, ooh, okay. Well, what about, and that's where I think they went with that paper. Okay.
Do we want to talk about CBD?
I will speak about some of the studies. It's early days yet. It may have potentially some sleep benefit for, I think, some individuals, but it's less clear that it's especially generalizable to all. I think it has benefits in the sense that it doesn't have a psychoactive component. So far, it doesn't necessarily seem to be having the same impact on REM sleep. We don't know about its tolerance. We don't know about withdrawal problems.
Mm.
But I do think there are several plausible mechanisms in my mind as to why it could work. But more generally, I think there's now emerging outside of sleep really very good data on CBD for helping people with anxiety. If you look, it seems to be something that provides what we call an anxiolytic benefit. There's been some great brain imaging studies there too. So far, I would say jury is out. Early data suggests it may not be as problematic, but the problem is there are not enough studies on just CBD alone, because usually most studies are using a combination of THC and CBD, and you therefore can't disambiguate those two.
A partner and sponsor of today's podcast is Shopify. Let me share the link right away. Shopify.com/Matt Walker. As someone who spends his days researching sleep, the idea of selling merch felt, well, rather daunting. But I kept getting asked if I had t-shirts or gear. So I finally said, okay, Matt, get your act together and give it a try. And we have them coming. But the big question was, how on earth was someone like me, a scientist, going to get these items into your hands? Everyone said the same thing, use Shopify. It turns out, even me, an analog man in a digital world, was able to do it without any learning curve. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world and 10% of all e-commerce in the US. From household names like Mattel and Gymshark to brands just getting started. With hundreds of ready-to-use templates, you can build a really impressive online store that matches your brand style. Oh, and if you need artificial intelligence-powered help writing product descriptions or touching up images, Shopify's got that too. All of which is to say that if you're ready to sell, just try Shopify. So if you are interested, turn your business idea into reality with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.com/Matt Walker. Once more, that's shopify.com/Matt Walker.
Can you describe some strategies for improving deep sleep duration?
When people ask me this question, how do I optimize stage X or how do I optimize stage Y? I try to have them think about two different directions. And what I mean by that is things to do that you're not doing or you're not doing enough of, and things that you need to stop doing or things you need to do less of. I know I've probably mentioned this before lots of times, and people probably won't want to hear it, but if you want to increase your deep sleep by way of obviating things that you're doing, alcohol and caffeine are your two biggest levers. So caffeine is in a class of drugs that we call the psychoactive stimulants, meaning it has an effect on your mind and it activates the mind, and therefore it is a stimulant. Most people already know that. What you probably are less aware of are some of the hidden consequences of caffeine on your sleep and particularly your deep sleep. I've spoken before about caffeine's half-life. Half-life just means what is the duration of time, typically for a drug, after which 50% of that drug is still in your system. And for caffeine, the half-life is around 5 to 6 hours for the average adult. So 5 to 6 hours later, about 50% of that caffeine in your coffee is still in your system. What that means is that caffeine has a quarter life of about 10 to 12 hours. So if you had a cup of coffee, let's say at 2 p.m., almost a quarter of that caffeine could still be circulating in your brain at midnight. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. It's a crass analogy, but I think it's the equivalent of instead getting into bed just before you turn off the light and you swig a quarter of a cup of coffee and hope that your sleep is protected, and it's not, probably, on average. But how does this relate to deep sleep? What we've discovered is that 1 to 2 cups of coffee, either early or late in the evening, and these would be standard drip brew cups of coffee, can decrease the amount of deep sleep by somewhere between about 20 to 40%, which is concerning. I think I found it concerning. I'm not someone who drinks coffee. I will occasionally have had times when I've been drinking coffee first thing in the morning. Unfortunately, based on my genetics, and I do all of these genetic tests, I am one of those caffeine sensitive individuals. So I just cannot even think about late morning coffee and not affecting my sleep. But that finding was quite striking. Just to put it in context, to drop your deep sleep by 20 to 40%, I'd probably have to age you by about 10 to 12 years. Or you could just do it with an espresso or a couple of espressos after dinner. I would also note that even somewhat modest doses of caffeine, probably around about 100 milligrams in the evening, will blunt the generation of your deep sleep. And those studies demonstrate that you can probably strip away about 30% of that deep electrical brainwave activity linked to slow wave or deep slow wave sleep. Especially, I should note there that 30% was looking at the first cycle of your sleep, the first non-REM to REM sleep cycle. But that's where you get most of your deep sleep anyway. Beyond making it harder to fall asleep, there is another way that caffeine will reduce the amount of deep sleep above and beyond simply blunting your brain's ability to electrically generate deep sleep. And this comes onto something that we call sleep fragmentation. Caffeine will make your sleep much more unstable, and therefore the probability that you're going to be waking up more throughout the night is increased. And it's what we call, as I mentioned, sleep fragmentation. Your sleep isn't nicely continuous. What's interesting is that the majority of that sleep fragmentation caused by caffeine happens in the first half of the night, which of course is when there is significantly more caffeine still in your system versus the second half of the night. When do we get the opportunity to get most of our deep sleep? Drum roll, in the first half of the night. And that is where your caffeine content is going to fragment your sleep most. If you are fragmenting your sleep, you're spending more time awake. If you're spending more time awake in the first half of the night, you're going to be spending less time in deep non-REM sleep. So I would say that trying to think about your caffeine intake is one way that you can improve the amount of deep sleep. Here, it is very much a case of the dose and the timing make the poison. I'm not suggesting necessarily that everyone should stop drinking coffee. Of course not. I love the smell of it. I love smelling it being brewed in the morning. Enjoy it. Life is to be lived. But if you want a strategy to increase your deep sleep, as I said, dose and timing here. So try to reduce the total amount of caffeine that you're taking on board throughout the day. So that would be the dose. And then try to stop drinking caffeinated coffee earlier in the day. And that would be the timing. So reduce the total amount, dose, and try to get that caffeine that you are going to have earlier in the day, and then stop doing that. Therefore, you will have more continuous sleep. Your brain will have its ability to generate the greatest amount of deep sleep. And I would say that's probably one of the best tips for trying to boost your deep sleep by way of the absence of something in addition to alcohol. So let me stop there.
So that would be beneficial for both the duration of deep sleep and the quality, right?
Correct. It would improve both the quantity of that deep sleep and the electrical quality, the power of those deep, slow brain waves.
You're right. We do have a question about alcohol, so we can perhaps connect those if you'd like.
That's great. The question is on the effects of alcohol.
Yeah, so it's the effects of alcohol before bed, its impact on sleep. And I know that can be connected to deep sleep duration as well. So we can combine those together.
That's great. Yeah. So alcohol, I think, would be one of the other things to moderate, at least, or be thoughtful about if you want to protect your deep sleep. And I recently did a discussion on this with someone else on the podcast as I was being interviewed. And so I'd been reading a lot about it. And there was a fascinating report from the World Health Organization just on alcohol in general. And one of the things that they were saying, I remember, was if you look at global consumption in terms of world regions, individuals in some parts of the world, particularly individuals in Eastern European countries, they would consume about 2 bottles of wine per week on average. That's for the average adult, which was quite striking. The second thing that if you look across probably the top 30 alcohol consuming countries, about 75% of individuals who were 16 years or older reported drinking alcohol several times a week. So I was quite surprised by that. And again, I'm not being judgmental here. I am not someone who drinks, not because I have any issues with it. It's just, I've never liked the taste. But anyway, onto some facts. That's what we're talking about here in terms of sleep. I'll start with sleep disruption. We certainly know that moderate alcohol doses, and this is when we say moderate, I'm talking about perhaps 1.5 glasses of wine, that will certainly sedate individuals into a loss of consciousness, and they will end up with moderate doses, let's say a glass or a glass and a half of wine. They'll probably lose consciousness about 5 to 7 minutes faster than they would otherwise fall asleep. I'm being very careful in my description here. If you go to higher doses, maybe 2.5, 3 glasses of wine, you can probably lose consciousness maybe 10 to 15 minutes faster than you would do otherwise. So in that regard, that's why many individuals will think of alcohol as a sleep aid, but we're about to find out it's no help at all, because this is where things get telling. Alcohol will increase the amount of time or the number of the awakenings throughout the night by about 20% on average. And again, this is modest amounts of alcohol. This is not high amounts of alcohol. I would also say that even in the second half of the night, there's some great studies that had people get just a little bit tipsy before bed. And in that second half of the night, they were 94% more likely to have experienced awakenings throughout the second half of the night than when they did not drink. Why would that be? Well, in part, it's because in the second half of the night, we have less of that sleep pressure weighing us down. Remember, when we're awake, we build up adenosine. The more adenosine we build up, the sleepier we feel, that sleep pressure. And then when we sleep, we dissipate that adenosine. And in the second half of the night, that's why sometimes it's harder to fall back asleep than the first half, because we've got less adenosine weighing us down. And therefore, the effects of alcohol on fragmenting your sleep are that much more impactful in the second half of the night, because your sleep is by nature more fragile and more vulnerable in that sleep pressure regard. There are some sex-specific effects. The impact of alcohol on sleep fragmentation is more prominent in females versus males, although both males and females will suffer from that sleep fragmentation. There is also age sensitivity. What we see in the studies is that the older an adult, the greater the degree of sleep disruption. And that in part seems to be explained by the fact that levels of plasma ethanol in the bloodstream of an older adult will remain higher after a standardized amount of alcohol relative to a young adult who has had the same amount of alcohol. And some of that has to do with the metabolic clearance capacities as we get older being reduced. So that's probably one of the reasons, I suspect one of many reasons. So I should also mention REM sleep. I know in the previous question we were speaking about just non-REM sleep, but here the question is more generally the effects of alcohol on sleep. REM sleep becomes a big factor too. Even modest amounts of alcohol will decrease the amount of REM sleep that you get by somewhere between 50 to 35% relative to a night of sobriety. it also impairs not just the quantity of your REM sleep, but alcohol will decrease the quality of your REM sleep. And what I mean here is the intensity of your REM sleep. And the way we measure that is the number of these rapid eye movements that you're having that are associated with these huge electrical bolts of activity that come up from the very deepest parts of your brain called the brainstem. And when you're having these bolts of electrical activity, then you get these rapid eye movements. And that's one of the ways that we measure the quality of your REM sleep. And sure enough, alcohol will drop the quality of your REM sleep, the intensity of those REM sleep eye movements, in addition to reducing the quantity of your REM sleep.
That's a huge effect, by the way.
It really is a very big effect. And we will often see something called a REM sleep rebound effect, where people who, let's say, go out on a Friday or a Saturday evening and they have a few too many drinks, they end up suppressing their REM sleep throughout the night so significantly. But because it's the weekend, they end up sleeping later into the morning. And finally, by sleeping longer, the alcohol is cleared out of the system in the very late morning hours. And then not only do you have the REM sleep that you would have into those later hours, you have that plus some of the additional REM sleep that your brain has understood you have been deprived of while the alcohol is circulating in your system. And you get even more intense REM sleep in that last hour or hour and a half of extra sleep that you're trying to get. It doesn't make up completely for the total reduction in REM sleep, but that's what's called a REM sleep rebound effect. And that is why after a few too many drinks in the evening and you sleep in at the weekend, people will say, gosh, I was out last night. We had a couple of bottles of wine. And this morning I was just having these really strange, really intense dreams. It's in part because of the REM sleep rebound effect. So maybe next question.
Before we go to the next question, I think people would love to hear about people sometimes combine coffee with naps. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I do. And in fact, I did a whole episode called The Caffeine Nap. And it's a real thing, or some people call it a nappuccino. And the reason is that when people drink coffee...
That sounds cute.
Doesn't it just... it sounds like a Disney character. When people drink coffee first thing in the morning, they say, look, darling, I'm sorry. I know I kind of left the kitchen in a state last night. Just let me just have a couple of sips of coffee and I'll be just fine. I'll be my better version of self. And after about 2 or 3 minutes, they say, oh, okay, now I'm good. I'm up to speed. I'm up and running. That's actually nonsense. The peak plasma concentration of caffeine doesn't hit until about somewhere between 9 to 12 or 14 minutes later. So whatever benefit you're feeling is either placebo, or it's probably more likely that you're drinking your coffee hot. And when we warm the core of our body up, we improve our alertness. You have to warm up to wake up. And the benefit that you get initially is one of a thermal benefit, because that can happen within the time frame of just a few minutes. But I'm sort of going aside. I told you that the peak caffeine concentration kicks in at around somewhere between 9 to 14 minutes, depending on the study. Why is this relevant to the nappuccino or the caffeine nap? Well, what people do is that they get themselves tucked into bed. And sometimes I've used this with professional athletes too. And I don't use it as a standard. I don't recommend it as a standard, but in certain circumstances, you can use it. And you get yourself ready for your nap, get your room dark, you're dressed in whatever you're going to dress in. And just before you tuck yourself into bed, you have a quick espresso shot or two, and then you turn the light out and you put your eye mask on, your earplugs in, and off you go, and you time your clock for maybe 20 or so minutes. And, take you a few minutes to drift off. So you get about 15 minutes of a nap. And I told you that after about 15 minutes, you will get some sleep inertia, which you prefer to avoid. But what's great is that just as the sleep inertia is about to kick in when you're about to wake up, that's now when the peak of the plasma concentration of caffeine is kicking in. So it ejects you out of the nap with this caffeine hit, and you overcome what would naturally otherwise be a slight downside of the inertia, but the caffeine overcomes that inertia, so you get the benefits of the nap without the downside of the sleep inertia, and that's the caffeine nap.
I see. Fascinating. I'm going to dream about a Disney character called Nappuccino. No doubt.
Yeah, I'm sure maybe I can convince Pixar. I've done a few films with them before, and they are very good at. I'll describe that in the
Yeah.
next brainstorming meeting that we have with them.
A partner for today's episode is AG1. I've been using AG1 for quite some time now, and just for the record, I buy it myself to stay away from any of those trappings of free product. AG1 has just released the new formulation, which is AG1 Next Gen. It's still one scoop once a day, but now comes with many upgraded probiotics, plus additional vitamins and minerals. I also explored their 4 human clinical trials to prove out their efficacy, with the data showing a marked boost in healthy gut bacteria. And that's the thing. I appreciate how AG1 keeps adapting to new scientific findings. They have made many formula changes over the years, and each new iteration keeps it at the cutting edge of this space. As I've mentioned, I began my AG1 journey over 4 years ago. Any company that holds their scientific rigor to the flames of clinical trials means a lot to me. So subscribe today to try the next gen of AG1. If you use the following link, you'll also get a free bottle of AGD 3K2, as well as an AG1 welcome kit and 5 of the upgraded AG1 travel packs with your first order. So make sure to check out drinkag1.com/Matt Walker. That's drinkag1.com/Matt Walker.
The last question, the juiciest one, very popular topic lately, psychedelics.
Oh, interesting.
People ask, how does psychedelics affect sleep? Drugs
Okay.
like LSD or psilocybin. And can we make the analogy that REM sleep is similar to what is happening when we take these drugs?
That latter question is REM sleep similar to psychedelic drugs? And then also back in the 60s and 70s, after we'd soon discovered REM sleep, the question was, is REM sleep also similar to psychosis? These have been common questions. Okay, how to deal with this? Let me see if I can break it down on the basis of the different psychedelics, and let me see if I can dig into the receptor systems and the brain chemicals, the neurotransmitters and the neurotransmitter receptors that those psychedelics alter, because that will probably help us better understand the changes that they have on sleep. Let me start with just how they affect the brain to begin with. Psilocybin and LSD, there the target in the brain is principally, not exclusively, but principally a neurochemical called serotonin. And serotonin, or 5-HT, has lots of different receptor types in the brain. The principal receptor subtype so far that I think science has corralled around regarding psilocybin and LSD is something that we call the serotonin, or the 5-HT, interchangeable, same thing. So the 5-HT, the serotonin receptor subtype, is called the 5-HT2A. There are other 5-HT receptors to a lesser degree that those psychedelics impact, but that's where we see some of the major heavy lifting done or impact done. What is the direction of how it affects those? Both of those compounds are what we call agonists of the 5-HT2A receptor. In other words, they will activate those receptors, so they will mimic an increase in serotonin signaling within the brain. I should probably also mention DMT, that's probably out there. It too affects serotonin. It too has been related to the 5-HT2A receptor. The direction of it, again, is that it is an agonist, meaning that it will stimulate the receptor. And so DMT, LSD, psilocybin, they seem to primarily influence and have their psychedelic effects through serotonin and through this receptor system. Now, again, it's not exclusive. What is that doing in the brain? There's lots of theories right now, but what we believe, at least in part, is that these psychedelics, by activating the serotonin system and the 5-HT2A receptor, lead to a consequential increase in the release of another brain chemical called glutamate. And that increase occurs in specific parts of the brain, which then probably brings me on to what do we know about the effects of psychedelics on brain activity before I come on to the effects of psychedelics on sleep. It's a very circuitous route, but I think it's helpful. Let me start with the effects of psychedelics on what we call functional brain connectivity. And Robin Carhart-Harris has done some excellent work on that. I think he'd done a great podcast, the most recent one I listened to, probably with my dear friend Andrew Huberman. He did a great podcast if you want to listen to that. Certainly what the field has been finding is that there is essentially an upscaling of the functional. Now, what is functional connectivity? The way that we describe functional connectivity in the human brain is just how many areas in the brain, different territories in the brain, are chatting to each other at any one moment in time. And we define that co-occurring activity as them being functionally connected. And what we find is that these psychedelics will typically increase globally the level of brain functional connect. Now, this is not structural connectivity. It's not that as soon as you take these drugs, the brain is rapidly changing its physical structure. This is about the activity. And that's what we mean by functional connectivity. And there is data, at least that I've read, that psilocybin can increase that by up to 20%. The other way that we can measure this is not by putting people in MRI scanners and looking at the functional connectivity of the brain, but using EEGs that we use in sleep recordings and looking at brainwave patterns. And there was a great study, I think back probably like 10 years ago now. They were finding about a 60% decrease in the alpha band power of the brainwaves. What on earth is the alpha band power? Your brain goes up and down in terms of its oscillations at different frequency ranges. It can go up and down in the slow frequency ranges of maybe 1 to 4 hertz or 1 to 4 cycles. That's what we call delta. Then you can get faster activity, somewhere between 4 to 8 hertz. That's what we call theta activity. Then somewhere between 8 to 12 hertz is what we call alpha activity. Then 12, 15 hertz, all the way up to maybe 25 hertz is what we call beta activity. And then there is gamma activity, which sits above that. And there seemed to be a very specific decrease in alpha band activity. Alpha band has been interesting. It's kind of being thought of as maybe the relaxation state of the brain, that when you relax or you meditate, you can get increases in alpha. And here we're seeing an actual decrease in that activity. Or perhaps it's related in the decrease in that relaxed brainwave pattern because of the upscaling increase in functional brain connectivity. You would think as you get more relaxed, maybe you get some of the benefits of these psychedelics, one of which is something that we call ego dissolution, where you just let go of your self-importance and you realize just how small we all are in this incredible thing called the world. And that ego dissolution can have many therapeutic benefits. And what they were finding is that that drop in alpha activity, which we don't fully understand, particularly over the back upper parts of the brain, was associated with the sensation of ego dissolution, of the removal of one's own self-centered, ego-driven centered view of one's importance. What about DMT? I probably haven't read the literature too much, but this probably starts to bring us on to sleep. Certainly the papers I've read on DMT were really more about sleep. And this comes back to your first part of the question. The changes in brainwave activity caused by DMT are actually very similar to those that we see in REM sleep. DMT can typically increase the amount of what we call theta activity, which, as you'll remember from my quick definition, theta activity is one step up from the slowest kind of activity, which is delta. Delta is somewhere between 0.5 hertz to about 4 hertz. So your brainwaves are only going up and down maybe 3 or 4 times a second. That's very slow. Theta activity, the next step up, that's somewhere between 4 to 8 hertz. Now, deep non-REM sleep exists in the territory of delta sleep, very slow but big, powerful, slow brain waves, somewhere between 0.5 to 4 hertz. REM sleep is one notch up. REM sleep is dominated by theta activity, somewhere between 4 to 8 cycles per second. So your brain waves are going up 4 to 8 times per second. That's the dominant theme of REM sleep. And when you give people DMT and they are awake, they seem to go into a theta-like, in other words, very REM sleep-like state. You can see from the papers I was reading, increases between 40 to 50% in theta activity caused by DMT, which seems to be associated with the dream-like hallucinations that people report on DMT. Maybe there is, for DMT at least, some degree of an overlap between the hallucinogenic sensory perceptual experience of DMT relative to the dreamlike theta hallucinogenic sensory distorted state that we call REM sleep. I've not answered your question, which is what about sleep changes? Architecture. There was a paper back, I think it was probably one of the first ones that I was reading back in 2016, certainly not the first paper on this topic, but it was a great controlled study. And what they found is that when they gave patients LSD, those patients exhibited across the next 24-hour period, it was over a 200% increase in wakefulness. So LSD seemed to be driving on the wakefulness switch. So forget changes in sleep architecture right now. We're just talking about it being an accelerator pedal of wakefulness. It then subsequently, when people fell asleep after LSD, it did disrupt their sleep. I think it was about 58% decrease in REM sleep. There was about a 20% drop in slow wave sleep. And that was the following night after the LSD. But then what was interesting is that as the LSD was being processed and being metabolized and removed out of the system, there was a comeback the next night. And this is what we typically see when we deprive people of specific stages of sleep, and then we finally let them sleep. The next night, they have what's called a rebound. And they did. They had about a compensatory 35% REM sleep rebound increase the second night after taking LSD. So LSD first night makes you more awake, decreases total sleep duration, decreases REM sleep by almost 60%, perhaps between 55 and 60%. It drops REM sleep by up to 20%. But then the next night, particularly REM sleep, fights back and you get this recovery night rebound effect of REM sleep. So LSD, I think the short story there is that it has an immediate sleep disrupting effect followed by a REM sleep rebound effect the subsequent night after the LSD night, if that makes sense. Oh, I should mention dream recall and LSD. What people have found is that participants can actually report on those, and it probably comes back to the intense REM sleep rebound on the second night. On those second night, there is a significant, seems to be up to about 50% increase in participants reporting dream recall. So whilst you are REM sleep deprived the first night, the next rebound night, you get an increase in REM sleep, and you seem to get, if recall is a metric of how much you are dreaming, which is debatable, you seem to dream considerably more the second rebound night after the first night of deprivation. I think that has some really interesting therapeutic ramifications. Why would I say therapeutic when we're talking about sleep disruption? Well, one of the things that we have been looking at in terms of use of LSD, and we have a fantastic Center for Psychedelic Research here at UC Berkeley through the amazing efforts of Michael Pollan and Tim Ferriss. Tim, you are an absolute gem. Thank you for making that happen too. And Michael, you're a dear friend who helps me with my writing of books and telling me what not to write and how to write. So certainly what we've been finding is that sleep deprivation can be one of the interesting, and I should do a podcast on this, one of the interesting treatments for major depression, that when we deprive people of sleep, you would think that that would make them worse. And in healthy individuals, your mood does get worse. But in patients with major depression, often sleep deprivation causes an antidepressant benefit. And that benefit is then lost when you finally go back to sleep. So are some of the therapeutic benefits of LSD that have been used, including in conditions of depression, in part because of that REM sleep disruption and total sleep disruption. And does the rebound sleep that you have and the dream recall have some kind of a role in processing the emotion, the intense emotional experience that you had during the increased wakefulness LSD trip? We've got so many theories that we're trying to test here.
So for, oh gosh, it must be at least a decade now, I have been an avid, probably more like rabid consumer of protein shakes. But the hard thing, honestly, in the supplement space, if you really understand and do your diligence, is this critical thing called trust. It is very hard to find a brand that you can truly trust. That's when I came across the company Puri and the really impressive founder. Even though I'm sure it makes them less profit versus other quick and loose companies, Puri takes quality more seriously than any company I've ever seen before. They have so many offerings, gosh, protein powders galore, but lots of other additions. But that's what I was focusing on here. Why did I choose them? Well, it's really for 4 specific reasons. Number 1, they are free from hormones. Number 2, they are free from GMOs. Number 3, they are free of any pesticides. And number 4, and this is the critical confidence part, every single batch is third-party tested for over 200 harmful contaminants, things like heavy metals, etc. All you have to do if you are a neurotic nerd like me, you can even scan the QRI code on the back of the product to get the third-party independent laboratory test results. That's how much trust and confidence they place in their product. By the way, if you want a recommendation, go for the dark chocolate flavored protein powder. It's just exceptional. In fact, it's wonderfully addictive. I didn't just say that. Anyway, it delivers 21 grams of protein per serving. And for folks of my podcast right now, you can save 20%. So go over to puri.com/Matt Walker, and that is spelled PUORI.com, Matt Walker. So again, that is PUORI.com/Matt Walker, and you will get 20% off your product.
DMT, I didn't really mention it. DMT, there was a great study, I think probably one of the original good studies was done by Strassman, and this was back in maybe 2001. And what they found is that when they administered DMT in the evening, it was also very sleep disruptive. It led to about a 50 to 60% reduction in the ability to fall asleep across the next 3 hours. So DMT experiences are probably not going to be experiences that are filled with immediate sleep that arrives with you with delightful alacrity.
Sleep is very spoiled in terms of the chemical soup it wants. So flooding the brain with all its neurotransmitters doesn't always bring on sleep.
Right. And I think what's interesting here, and neither you or I, we're not suggesting that any of these psychedelics are to be frowned upon just because they disrupt their sleep. I think it's going to be an amazing revolution in the field of psychiatric medicine, for which there has been no revolution. If you look at, for example, and Tom Insel, the previous head of the National Institutes of Mental Health, NIH has said this, if you look at things like cancer, we've been able to bend the arrow of certain forms of cancer down on itself across the previous 50 years. But when you look at mental health, we have not been able to bend that curve almost at all. Now, that's not to say psychiatry has not tried. It's done amazing efforts, and we've developed some very interesting compounds. But really, if you look at it relative to some other areas of medicine, there has not been the same therapeutic development. I think psychedelics have the potential, if we do it right. I think people like Tim Ferriss have spoken a lot about how we should be doing it right, and how a lot of the clinical medical folks that he's been connecting with are telling us how we need to do it right. If we do it right, I think it could cause a seismic shift in our treatment of numerous mental health conditions. Right now, based on the efficacy of them, I'm really excited to work on the sleep component of it. We've been trying to get philanthropic funds, and if anyone is interested in trying to reach out to me to support this work. It's very difficult to get funded. But I think sleep has a prominent role to play in the therapeutic journey of these mind-altering drugs. We have no idea, and I think we need to. For example, is the sleep that you've been having leading into your LSD or your psilocybin therapeutic treatment, does that predict your ultimate long-term therapeutic outcome? Or does the sleep disruption that you have predict whether or not you get a therapy benefit? And how is sleep then in the subsequent weeks or months afterwards interacting with and predicting the improvement or lack thereof of these psychiatric symptoms? Considering the overlap between the systems and the neurochemical systems and the changes that we already know caused by these psychedelics upon sleep, I think sleep has a very untold story to tell in that equation. We just need to get the funds to be able to do it. I also realized, Eti, I have not mentioned, and it's not a psychedelic, but there is MDMA, ecstasy, street name Molly here, I believe in the United States at least. And MDMA is not necessarily a psychedelic. In fact, it's not a psychedelic. It doesn't alter your sensory perception, which is what a psychedelic does. It doesn't alter your vision or what you're hearing or what you're feeling or what you're tasting. MDMA is what we call an empathogen, and it's a very pro-social, or I think people call it essentially a pro-love drug. That too has had some work on sleep. I don't think anywhere near enough for us to understand the real changes yet, but I would say that MDMA should not be left out of this psychiatric chemical revolution that's probably going to happen in psychiatric illness. And I think sleep can play a major role there because many of the neurotransmitters it affects also play a fundamental role in sleep. And many of the brain areas that MDMA acts upon are areas that are very active in sleep, particularly during REM sleep.
Matt, do you want to talk a little bit about ketamine?
Oh, thank you. Yes. Ketamine is not necessarily a psychedelic, although it can have sensory perceptual distortions, particularly sensations of, I think, length of one's limbs. Ketamine is typically described as what we call a dissociative drug. The notion is that you can dissociate from perhaps what you've been clinging on to strongly in terms of your aspects of self-identity. And that aspect of dissociation has been suggested to have therapeutic benefits. The other way that people have described ketamine therapy, and it's principally used, I think right now, if you look at the data, for a treatment for depression, although there's other areas of treatment use that are coming online. Why is ketamine interesting in the context of sleep? Well, firstly, one of the things that some researchers do to try to study those deep, slow brain waves of deep non-REM sleep is to use ketamine infusions. And they've typically done this in animal models. We don't do animal research at the center. It's the Center for Human Sleep Science. But they've been using that, and they will almost be able to induce a state that looks not dissimilar to deep, slow wave sleep. And in fact, medically, ketamine is used in higher doses in terms of anesthesia. It's used as one of the tools in the anesthesia. So if you've had some form of anesthesia, let's say you've had the delight of a colonoscopy coming up probably in my future, considering my age now as I'm solidly entering into the territory of the 40s, then ketamine could be part of that anesthesia equation. So it is used in medicine, but it's also used therapeutically. By the way, it's also used recreationally as well. People will use it. It's illegal to use it in that way, but I'm not going to judge. But its treatment for psychiatric major depression has been very impressive. I described it as being something that will help dissociate an individual. But that's also not thought to be the only mechanism of potential root. The other mechanism is changes in brain plasticity, principally by way of altering and increasing something that we call BDNF, which stands for brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And the infusion of ketamine into the cortex of the brain increases brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And neurotrophic factor means that it increases the number of synapses in the brain. That has been proposed as the longer term antidepressant benefit of ketamine. Why is that important? Well, it's important because, as I mentioned, we, the sleep researchers, will use ketamine to induce slow waves in the brain and study them. And we also know that deep slow wave sleep is critical for regulating the synaptic brain plasticity in the cortex. And therefore, what we've also found, these were studies going back to the 90s. Again, Feinberg and Campbell were showing some early studies where they described both the antidepressant benefit of ketamine that was linked to an increase in deep slow wave sleep. So perhaps it's not just about ketamine inducing increases in BDNF. Perhaps it's the fact that ketamine at night will also increase the amount of deep slow wave sleep. And it's the deep slow wave sleep that helps recalibrate the synapses in the brain. And you can see this happening every single night. It doesn't take weeks to happen. That benefit can happen at night. And those plasticity related changes caused by the ketamine induced increase in slow wave sleep have been thought to be perhaps one of the reasons why slow wave sleep has been associated with major depression. It's not just slow wave sleep, though. There is also data showing that across the board, sleep is just better following ketamine. I think there is some animal work back in the 1990s demonstrating, for example, that your total sleep time will increase, the percentage of time that you're awake decreases, the amount of time spent in REM sleep increases, and the amount of time spent in slow wave sleep increases. So in other words, you get more sleep because you spend less time awake, and that less time awake is filled by more REM sleep and more slow wave sleep. So I think it's another fascinating area, and we would love to do a lot of work in this area too. You and I, Eti, were very interested and committed to the idea of looking at sleep and suicide. There's a very powerful risk between sleep disruption and even more so nightmares and suicide. I think this is a very interesting area to look at regarding the interaction with psychedelics and ketamine and decreasing and dissipating suicide risk too. I have said way too much on this topic. Anything you want to add before we close?
I think it's a beautiful example thinking about the interaction between sleep, depression, and ketamine, exactly touching on what you said about the potential, the beautiful array of things we can look at when we combine psychedelics into our research. So I'm definitely on board. And is it fair to say that we can't really give a general how do psychedelics impact sleep? It kind of depends on the drug itself, right?
Yeah, I think there is an overarching theme that psychedelics, psilocybin, LSD, DMT, and there, of course, there are other psychedelics, but those are the ones where I think the literature is strongest to comment on. Those all seem to have a generally similar impact on sleep the first night, which is that sleep is more disrupted and you get less of it. And then there are some interesting changes in the rebound nights that do occur and how we understand the impact of that on the mental health benefits regarding sleep interaction, disruption, and then rebound. We have no real understanding right now. And you're right that there are subtle differences then in the architectural changes of sleep between those different drugs. Then there is also a very different story to ketamine relative to those psychedelic drugs of LSD, psilocybin, and DMT. And I think there's going to be a very different story that emerges for MDMA. It's early stages yet, as it is with that field in general. But I believe sleep is going to be certainly a significant voice of explanatory understanding in the work of psychedelics and other such related drugs
Absolutely.
upon mental health. Well, with that, we have wrapped up another AMA, Ask Me Anything. I will thank you, Eti, once again for being such a wonderful partner in crime. You make these things a sublime joy to do. And I know for the listeners, based on some of the comments, it is a sublime listening experience that is the perfect antidote to the unpleasant experience that is listening to me monologue. So thank you for joining, Eti.
Thank you for having me, Matt.
So we will see you in the next episode of these AMAs, and you will hear from me, unfortunately, in a monologue in another standard episode coming your way very soon. For now, take care, sleep well.